with rasterization, you're processing one triangle at a time, right? And you're taking that triangle, converting it into pixels on the screen that are there painted using some sort of shading procedure that you determine. And the problem here is that most lighting interactions are not exactly local. Most interesting lighting interactions turn out to require knowledge of the scene around you. But with rasterization, this is really difficult, right? All the information you get to compute your color ends up being determined by whatever you can attach to the three vertices of the triangle, either directly via interpolance or indirectly via some sort of texture map lookups. This tends to work for stuff like direct lighting, for instance, where you can actually have a list of lights that you traverse in the pixel shader. But for something like shadows, for instance, you need information about what is around you in the scene, and that's just not available, right? So, we can come up with clever techniques, and certainly we have come up with clever techniques to render such things like shadow maps, which require you to process the geometry all over again from a different point of view and establish this texture that contains distance information from the light, and then reproject it back, traverse that texture, interpolate between two values or filter between two values, and then you get sort of these weird artifacts sometimes. And so it's complicated to achieve good visual fidelity with techniques that process one triangle at a time. Now, certainly you guys have, the gaming industry, you guys have taught us exactly how much you can do with rasterization. You look at a AAA game today, and certainly you get stunning imagery, of course, and I love playing games, and I spend more time on that than I should, really. But there's something missing there, right? And all of these techniques are incredibly complicated, and rasterization is not popular because it's simple to use. It's popular because it's computationally cheap, right? And it's very, very amenable to hardware implementations. Certainly, GPUs have evolved to become these massively powerful rasterization machines. And that's precisely because this technique is cheap and very amenable to hardware implementation that it became so popular. Now, in contrast, with ray tracing, you're not processing one primitive at a time. You're actually sampling the entire scene one ray at a time, right? So you pick a starting point, you pick a direction. With ray tracing, you're going to get a list of intersections of all the intersections of your ray with all the geometry in your scene, right? So the entire scene is implicitly evaluated every time you trace, right? Because you know that these are all the intersections you get along that line. You know that no other primitive exists along that line, right? So you've tested the entire scene along a sample direction. So the entire scene geometry is available. The entire scene database is available. Each primitive can be visited many times as opposed, well, with rasterization, typically in one pass, you visit each triangle once. And so it's an extremely flexible approach that allows you to accurately simulate, light transport based on physical properties of light, even if you want to go that far. The simple example of shadows becomes trivial where, if you're shading a given point, you want to test visibility for a light, you just shoot a ray and see if there's anything in between the point you're shading and the light. That becomes obvious and trivial with ray tracing. And so it's incredibly flexible. It can do pretty much anything given enough time. But of course, the drawback is that it can be computationally intensive, and that's why it hasn't been a really popular technique for real-time rendering so far. Now, as I alluded to, for real-time graphics, pretty much rasterization is king. And so far, up until recently at least, most hardware was developed towards rasterization, and GPUs evolved to become these massive parallel rasterization and shading machines that we know today. And at NVIDIA, graphics is kind of a thing we like. We tend to put a lot of effort into graphics R&D. And ever since we got our first programmable shaders, we started looking at whether we could use them for ray tracing. Around 2007, we released CUDA, which is our general-purpose GPU computing platform. And immediately, we switched our ray tracing research to focus on, well, how can we use this to accelerate ray tracing on GPUs? How can we make ray tracing really fast using this general-purpose computational platform that we've developed? And this eventually led to the release of optics. And in 2010, we had a SIGGRAPH paper that detail the architecture of optics. And now, for those who might not be familiar, optics is essentially a raycasting SDK. It is an SDK that you can use to build any application that uses ray tracing, right? It's not a renderer, and I want to make this clear because you can actually use optics for many other applications that are not graphics related. It is an accelerated raycasting SDK. And in developing optics, we've built this body of knowledge on how to build very efficient accelerated ray tracing SDKs and libraries on top of our CUDA platform. And so if you've seen any of the recent ray tracing APIs already, some of these building blocks may actually look familiar. With optics, the user specifies all of the yellow blocks in this diagram. So you specify a little kernel of CUDA code to generate rays, to compute the interaction of a ray with a surface that was intersected, to compute the intersection itself if you want to compute intersections with custom primitives that optics doesn't support directly, and so on. And so we've built all of this knowledge over the course of more than a decade of R&D on how to expose ray tracing in a way that's useful for developers and in a way that allows us to continue to develop and accelerate further the process of tracing rays against the scene database. And last year here at GDC, we announced NVIDIA's RTX, which is kind of the culmination of these 10 plus years of research into accelerated ray tracing. We originally announced this on top of our Volta architecture. And RTX is kind of the name for this core technology that we've built that enables us to accelerate ray tracing so efficiently. I call this the kind of the marketing architecture slide. It just shows that RTX is now kind of our core technology that underlies all of our implementations of accelerated ray tracing, including optics, our ray tracing extensions for Vulkan, which I'm covering today, also our implementation of Microsoft's DXR. And of course, in the summer of 2018, we launched Turing, which is our first GPU with hardware accelerated ray tracing. This kind of provides an order of magnitude difference in terms of performance for tracing rays against the scene. We have these numbers of throughput that we talk about of something like 10 gigaраys per second peak throughput. And so this is sort of an order of magnitude above what we could do before. And it allows for many more real-time applications to become useful. So I have a few examples of some stuff that we've been looking into that is now viable in real time. I may have mentioned shadows a couple of times before. This is an example of ray traced shadows. So in the top, we have a single directional light casting light over a scene. Think of it as the sun through an open window, or, well, the window is closed, actually. Sun through a window, you see pixel-perfect shadows everywhere. There's no artifacts from, say, shadow map cascade transitions or anything. The sampling rate is 1 ray per pixel. So every ray is cast, every pixel that is shaded gets a ray cast to the light source, and you get perfect information. Down below, we have the same scene lit through kind of a filtering material. Think of it as, we close a curtain. And so you get this kind of soft light effect. This is really hard to do with rasterization. But of course, with ray tracing, it becomes more natural. You can actually sample an area light in a physically correct way with ray tracing. And that's kind of what we're doing here, along with some denoising applied to it. So you get these perfect contact hardening effects where the occluder becomes closer to the point being shaded, whereas the shadow gets more and more diffuse, but very smooth as you step away from the occluder. Along the same lines, we've been investigating ray traced ambient occlusion, and I personally really like this effect where AO really brings out depth in the scene, but with screen space techniques, you're limited to however much information you happen to have in the depth buffer, which is usually not a lot. You can certainly see in the basket over there that the SSAO version is kind of blurry, whereas with RTAO, for every point that we're computing AO for, we have full information of the neighborhood. We can sample the neighborhood in any way we want. And so you get a much more crisp and detailed ambient occlusion terms, which actually bring out a lot of depth to the image. And of course, shiny reflections have been a part of ray tracing forever, so we couldn't have a presentation without a slide with shiny reflections. Ray tracing makes reflections very, very easy because, again, you can just shoot a ray in a different direction and sample the scene that way. Again, this is typically really hard to do with rasterization in a way that's as accurate as you get out of ray tracing. But we've actually gone a bit further than that. So 2 days ago at the GTC keynote, we presented a version of Quake 2 that is fully path traced. And this is an image from that demo. What this demo does is actually full-blown path tracing in real time, right? There's no rasterization involved apart from like the UI elements at the bottom and stuff like that. All of the light interactions are computed in real time using physically accurate algorithms and physically accurate materials. Everything is dynamic. The lights, you can move the sun and everything moves as you would expect. It pretty much just works. And it's actually really interesting to see. I have a quick video of this that I'll show later on. And it's worth remembering that ray tracing is not actually just for graphics. There's other applications you can use for ray tracing. AI visibility queries, audio simulation, stuff like that. All of that can benefit from ray tracing acceleration as well.